Welcome back to the West London Witch. This episode contains adult and distressing themes and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. My family liked to play a little game called Would You Live in That House? We'll go on wine and walks around the neighborhood and discuss the pros and cons of each home. That one was tented for termites last year, so that is a no. That one has a big lot. That's a yes. That one has a side door as opposed to a front-facing door, so that's a no. That one has flowering wisteria. Big yes. My mom and I could play this game for hours. Naturally, sometimes it takes a darker turn. For example, could you live in the Tower of London? Or would you be comfortable in a home where a terrible event occurred? This game always brings about interesting conversations about fear, what's natural or unnatural, stigmatized versus unstigmatized deaths, and of course, property value. My husband and I live in a cottage built in the 1800s that sits on the edge of a graveyard. I know for a fact that people have died in this house. But as far as I've been able to research, no one has passed in a violent fashion. And I'm comfortable with that. But when we play this game, I always think of the Castaneda family. When I was a kid, I did theater with two girls whose parents faced this very dilemma in the most horrifying way. From what I remember of the account, the Castanedas had bought a home in the lush and exclusive country club in my hometown. The house was beautiful and boasted all of the luxuries of California living. A pool, tennis courts, 4-car garage, all while being safely secured inside the gates of this restricted community. While the home was in escrow, Mrs. Castaneda went out for lunch with a girlfriend. As she sat telling her friend all about the new home and the move, the woman looked up and said, "You don't mean the house in the country club, right? The big white one with the tennis courts?" "Why, yes." "Why would you want to live there?" "Well, not only is it a beautiful home, but it's also in a great school district. And it's near all the kids' activities, and it was a great price." "I bet it was. June, you cannot move your kids into that house." "Well, I can, and I am. We're in escrow as we speak." "How do you know about this house?" "It's a small town, June. Everyone knows about that house." "Well, I don't. What am I missing here?" "Well, it did happen a while ago, but once a family lived in that house. A husband, a wife, 2 little girls. Beautiful family. He got into some money trouble, gambling, overspending, issues at work, and she had no idea. She was redecorating the home. The kids had private tennis lessons. Bought a horse, you know the type. Well, one night, after a fight and too much whiskey, he went after his wife with an axe, chopped her to pieces. Then he went upstairs and hacked his daughters to death. In a fit of madness, he piled their broken, bloody remains in the front room and then smeared the freshly decorated walls with their blood. As the sun came up and he came to his senses, he took out his revolver and put a bullet between his eyes. I think it was the housekeeper who found them lying in that heap." Mrs. Castaneda felt the blood wash out of her extremities and leave her cold and numb. Her friend, unbothered and full of gruesome glee, continued. "Anyway, the house has been a revolving door ever since. Someone always picks it up because of its assets and the location, but no one stays long. That's why you got the place so cheap." "No one told us." "Surely they should have told us." 3 years, that's the rule in California. They don't have to disclose after 3 years. Besides, there's nothing physically or structurally wrong with the house. It's not a material issue. But it's still horrible to think about. Could you have family movie night in a room where a family was once hacked to death? No, I don't think I could. The Castanedas pulled out of the cell that very afternoon. They lost money on the home, but money can't buy peace of mind. I remember Mrs. Castaneda telling my mom this story when they didn't think us kids were listening. And I won't forget her saying that she would never be at peace in that home. She would never get over the mental image she had created in her mind. So, when I play, Would You Live in That House? Sometimes I wonder if the wisteria or RV parking could ever outweigh whatever intangible elements that may be lingering within the walls. As many of you will agree, autumn is the most wonderful time of the year. Sure, Christmas is great and Thanksgiving is fine, but there is nothing as special as Halloween time. To see the trees ablaze in orange foliage, jack-o'-lanterns on the porch, ghouls and witches everywhere, and candy corn, of course. If you are feeling spirited this year, head on over to the West London Witch Patreon and share your good cheer with two creatives who aim to bring you Halloween all year. For just a small fee, you can bring endless glee to the little witch who shares with you these spooky stories. Now, don't let my attempt at poetry scare you away. Head on over to the West London Witch Patreon today. Hello and welcome to episode 79 of the West London Witch, a podcast where we share stories about those moments where we find ourselves very much not alone. This year for Halloween, I thought we would do something really special. Our very first two-part episode. As long-term listeners of the show, you will know that I love having primary resources tell their accounts of iconic cases. The internet can be such a murky lagoon of myths or twisted information that whenever I can bring to you a first-hand account on a case, I do. Today, we are in for a real treat. Everyone thinks they know the Amityville Horror story. God knows there's been enough movies, books, and spin-offs connected to the case. But have you ever heard the story from someone who was actually there and was a neutral, unbiased observer? Laura Didio was just 20 years old when her internship at Channel 5 News led her into investigating one of the most famous paranormal cases of all time. You may think that you know the story of Amityville, but I assure you that you have never seen the case from this perspective before. I'm Rebecca Strazina, and this is the West London Witch, episode 79, Analyzing Amityville, part 1.
I'm Laura Didio, and I was born and raised in Queens, New York. I aspired at an early age to become a reporter or a journalist. So I like to write. I was always very curious. And I think everybody likes a good ghost story. I have to quote my good friend, mentor, Marvin Scott, who I worked with at Channel 5 News. And he was actually the reporter, the on-camera reporter of record on the Amityville case.
Laura's love of writing took her to Fordham University, where she pursued her degree in journalism. Her hunger and charisma led her to create a radio show called Dimension. This interview-style show was not just an on-campus show, but was blasted out across the wider New York City area.
That really allowed me to tap into interviewing, this rich panoply of people. You're talking politicians, sports figures, artists, actresses, actors. And of course, I had always been interested in the supernatural.
Being an inquisitive and naturally critical thinker, Laura was intrigued by the topic of the supernatural, but was also in a position where she could challenge, discuss, and dig deeper into the possibilities and potential shortcomings of the paranormal.
Let's just say the paranormal, as we talk about it today, has always attracted charlatans en masse. You have to be careful. So fast forward, I had the chance to interview at Dimension all of the people who were big in the paranormal, the supernatural at the time, from Hans Holzer, who I think could be classified as one of the grandfathers of paranormal and quote unquote ghost hunting, to Ed and Lorraine Warren, who had a very nice reputation in the New England area, but were not known nationally.
In addition to being a student and hosting Dimension, Laura also undertook an internship at Channel 5 News.
I became sort of like a stringer. They'd pay me to do these little projects. Then I was on part-time. And so before I graduated, I was working there almost full-time as a little lowly news assistant, and general factotum, which is a lot of work for very little money, but you gain the experience.
With Laura's experience in not only journalism, but also the paranormal space, she found herself perfectly positioned to level up from a lowly intern into an actual asset to Channel 5 News. A new case was about to not only rock New York, but the world. And it would also send Laura on the wildest adventure of her career.
The Amityville case, the Amityville Horror as we know it today, actually began with the Defeo murders. Ronald Defeo Sr. and his wife and their 5 kids had moved in 1965 from Brooklyn to Long Island. Big, beautiful house. And for anybody who's listening, most of you have seen the house in movies and things, but just to set the stage, they were a middle class to upper middle class family. Louise Briganti Defeo, her father, Michael Briganti Sr., owned a car dealership. He employed both his son-in-law and his grandson, Ronald Defeo Jr. So in the early morning hours of November 13th, 1974, Ronnie Jr. had he had a drug problem. He was a wise apple. He was sort of a punk. He got a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, no silencer on it. He was high as a kite, having done a lot of drugs that night, and he was an inveterate drinker and druggie. And he took the rifle, and within 15, 20 minutes, he had shot his entire family. His parents in their bed, 2 shots each, close range, and all 4 of his siblings, Mark, John, Allison, and Dawn. And this is a big house. It's a beautiful neighborhood. And this is a 3-story Dutch colonial with a finished basement. So it's pretty big. It's about 5,000 square feet.
This gorgeous home sits on the Amityville River, and is complete with a boathouse, swimming pool, large yard, and finished basement. It is a jewel of a property, ironically named High Hopes.
And that shocked everybody. Even in New York City, where you might have expected to see greater crime, 60 miles away, this just did not happen in the town of Amityville. So at first, Ronnie Jr., he called the cops. He had a very convenient thing, said, my family's been murdered, and then the police swarmed the place. And he says, I think it could have been a mob hit. It could have been this. He was throwing out his own theories. In truth, and sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and this is one of those cases, with the Defeo family, there were mob connections on both sides of the family. And at the Buick dealership, what Ronnie had done, it took them about 36 hours. They originally took Ronnie Defeo Jr. into protective custody. But it didn't take them long to zero in on him as the prime suspect. And after a 12-hour interrogation, this one detective did get him to admit that he killed his family. When the detective said to him, why did you do it? He says, I don't know. I just started, and then everything went so fast, and I couldn't stop. Now, there were some question marks left that not even the experts, the forensic evidence, the police, or the coroner could explain. The first was that there were no drugs found in the Defeo system.
This brings us to our first big mystery. Ronnie Defeo systematically killed his family with a .35 caliber Marlin 336C rifle. The family were asleep in their beds on multiple floors. Their bodies were discovered lying on their stomachs, and there did not appear to be any real signs of struggle or escape. How did the victims not hear the blasts from the gun and run and hide? How did they all remain in their beds if they were not drugged?
Obviously, if somebody is shooting you and you're in bed, your body is going to jerk with the force of the shot. The father was starting to, prop himself up. There's evidence that the mother, Louise, so she was shot in the chest. They didn't have time to react. They were shot twice, close range, and it was fatal. They did not linger. But what about the two brothers across the hall? Well, the youngest brother had a football injury, and he was in a wheelchair and walking with crutches. He wasn't going to be able to move very fast. But that doesn't explain why Dawn on the third floor, who was 18, Allison, 13, right across the hall, and the other brother, Mark, who was 12, why they didn't hear something and react, or why nobody tried to get away. If you see somebody who has a gun, your first reaction is going to be, wow, I'm going to try and duck and cover. And none of that happened. Ronnie Defeo Jr., a.k.a. Butch, as the family called him, apparently he did tell one of the detectives that his sister Dawn on the third floor said, oh, is that you, Butch? And he says, yeah, Dawn, go back to bed. Everything's going to be okay. Well, I'm sorry. If I'm on the third floor and I hear shots, I don't believe what he said to the detective there.
These murders were beyond gruesome. Both Mr. and Mrs. Defeo were shot twice. Ronnie's sisters were shot in the head. His brothers were shot in the back. And Ronnie even made a chilling confession that he stood and watched as his baby brother's leg twitched uncontrollably as he died. The girls' rooms were splattered in blood and brain matter, and the mirrored wall behind his parents' bed reflected back a double image of the slaying. In a matter of minutes, Ronnie Defeo Jr. had slaughtered his father, Ronald Defeo Sr., his mother Louise, sister Dawn, age 18, sister Allison, age 13, and his two little brothers, Mark, age 12, and John Matthew, age 7. What perplexed the police, though, was that no one heard the shots. Not a single neighbor heard the blasts, screams, or any sign of commotion. But the even bigger question was, why did Ronnie do this? He came from a good family, lived in a nice home, had so many opportunities afforded to him. What could possibly be the motive for slaughtering his entire family?
It would be fair to say that Ronnie Jr. had problems. He fought with his parents, especially he clashed with the father. But the parents at the time actually took him at the age of when he was prepubescent to see a psychologist. If you go back to the 60s or the 70s, people didn't spare the rod and spoil a child. In the Defeo case, there was corporal punishment, which was normal for the times. I don't mean that he was stuffed in a closet and hung on the rack or put in a cage. None of the really gory things that we hear about today. But there was pushing and shoving.
Despite the harsh punishments, Ronnie's parents also indulged their child. They bought him a car, a boat, and allowed him to keep guns. They even sorted him out with a job as a delivery driver at his grandfather's Buick dealership. It was a low-level job, but all of his needs were met, and the lack of responsibility suited him just fine.
So Ronnie drops out of school. He's just hanging around the neighborhood. His parents give him money, they give him the car. So here he is, 18, 19, 20. He was 23 when he murdered his family. And he's feeling pretty good about himself. Big man around town, very boastful. He had attempted once before, a year earlier, to shoot his father, but the gun jammed. And so Big Ronnie Sr. gets religion in a big way. He says, I really dodged a bullet, with the devil. So why, after that, you would think, boom, take his gun away. This is a no-brainer. But they would get into fights, he and his father on the side lawn. Then Ronnie Jr. would drive off and his father would chase him around the neighborhood. So several weeks before the murders, Ronnie Jr. is at work and he's tasked with making a bank deposit. Cash, $20,000 in cash. So he and another employee of the Buick dealership go off to make this bank deposit. They're gone for 3 hours. They come back and their clothes are messed up and they say, we were mugged, we were robbed, and the money is gone.
In the weeks following the supposed mugging, Ronnie Jr. was seen blowing money around town like a frivolous, drunken sailor on leave. Not the smartest move for a man with a minimum wage job. Ronald Defeo Sr. knew what his son had done and was putting pressure on him to come clean, own up to the crime, and pay restitution to his grandfather. Ronnie Jr. knew that his house of cards was about to crumble around him.
That's the closest thing to a motive anybody could come to. Because why did he decide to do it this night? He had been out, and heroin was very big in the mid-70s in New York. Heroin, marijuana, and he was shooting up. He was smoking marijuana in the basement, watching TV, and then he just gets this idea, I'm going to kill my family. He was smart enough to take a shower after the murders, change his clothes, deposit his bloodied clothes into a bag, take the parts of the rifle, and then leave the scene of the crime and deposit the bag with the bloodied clothes in a sewer. He threw something out, something else someplace else. And so after the police were able to get him to make the confession, he told them exactly where he put the things.
The family were killed on November 13th, 1974. And less than a year later, in October 1975, Ronnie's trial began. After burning through 3 different defense attorneys, Ronnie finally settled with William Weber, an esteemed and accomplished criminal defense lawyer. Weber's first task was to create a compelling and creative defense for this truly indefensible crime.
These Defeo murders happened right after the movie The Exorcist hit, but before the slasher films became in vogue. So essentially, William Weber, being a smart guy, smart attorney, decides, hey, what if we play up this aspect in the trial?
Weber argued to the court that Ronnie was actually insane at the time of the murders and had zero recollection of killing his family.
But that idea of the devil made me do it defense was a novel one at the time.
On November 21st, 1975, 37 days after his trial began, Ronnie Defeo was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was later sentenced to 6 25-to-life sentences. Judge Thomas Stark categorized this crime as the most heinous murders committed in Suffolk County since its founding. However, not all was lost for Defeo, as his attorney, William Weber, was already beginning to plan his appeal.
Fast forward to the Lutz family moving in. At that point, George Lutz and Kathy Connors Quarantino Lutz had gotten married in July of 1975. This was going to be their dream house. George was running a family surveying business on Long Island. It was 3rd generation. His grandfather had it. He had about 5 or 6 employees. And his idea was to move his offices into the house rather than keep the office so he could save money that way. But it was perfect. He had motorcycles. Kathy had been divorced from her high school sweetheart. She had 3 children. Melissa, 5. Christopher, 7. And Danny, the oldest, was 9 when they moved in. And supposedly they talked about it as a family, bad thing. They must have told the kids bad things happened in this house, but everything's going to be great now. Well, we all know the outline of the story, which is they move in and they move out.
After a mere 28 days in their dream home, the Lutz family fled. Not because of the ghosts of Defeos, but rather unknown supernatural phenomenon. Interestingly enough, the Lutzes never claimed to be haunted by the murdered family. However, if abandoning their dream home wasn't strange enough, it was their next move that really changed the course of history.
The Lutzes had made contact with William Weber, Ronnie Jr.'s defense attorney, and said, hey, did he ever say that there was anything strange that happened in the house while the Defeo family lived there?
This phone call was an absolute gift to Weber. He now had potentially new evidence to offer as a reason for an appeal. He quickly not only got in contact with the Lutzes, but actually befriended them. One night, the Lutzes and William Weber got together to discuss 112 Ocean Avenue. As the night wore on, multiple bottles of wine were consumed, and Weber began to record the Lutzes' experiences in the home. These tapes are real. All parties admit to their veracity, and Laura herself has even heard them.
William Weber, who says that they all concocted the story over several bottles of wine. William Weber was the one who had the idea and who was really driving the narrative here. He said, we can put the house in a trust with all 4 of us, him, his law partner, and then George and Kathy Lutz. And we can get at least a couple of books out of this and a movie or 2. And you hear the Lutzes agreeing to it, but they were not the ones who were actively promoting this. William Weber had a very well-defined framework for all of this. And the Lutzs were going along with it.
These tapes are damning. They outline a veritable playbook for a haunting. For example, the Lutzs very famously declared that the house was plagued by pervasive and mysterious flies. Supernatural amounts of flies, only possible if connected to an otherworldly force. However, Weber states that they came up with that claim after seeing crime scene photos of Dawn's bedroom, in which flies had appeared to feast on the blood and remains left in the wake of the murder. The green ectoplasm, which oozed from the house on the final night of the Lutz's tenure, was actually inspired by green fingerprint dust left over from the investigation. Laura has heard these tapes, and George and Kathy did admit to her that in the cold, sober light of day, they were not proud of this night of planning. Weber had convinced the Lutzs that the possibilities for this story were endless. Forget just Ronnie's appeal. Weber had Hollywood in mind. So, William Weber, acting as the spokesperson for not only Ronnie Defeo, but now also the Lutzs, held a press conference at his office where he made the connection between the supernatural events and Ronnie Defeo's motive for murder. However, it wasn't long before the Lutzs had a falling out with Weber and eventually sold the story to Jay Anson, writer of the 1977 classic, The Amityville Horror.
After the Lutzs had this initial press conference in William Weber's office, they went underground in a way that they would not be able to go underground today. And by underground, they went to live with Kathy's mother, who had a different name, but nobody could really contact them. So the entire media press corps in New York at that time that was trying to get this story, you've just hung this out here. Oh, family flees home that had been the scene of 6 violent murders. Supernatural at work here. Wow. Bam. It was a recipe for high interest at the time. Now, a lot of people would have thought, oh, this is a big hoax. This is BS. This kid is trying to get off. He was convicted. And these people are just out looking for fame and fortune. But whether or not it was a hoax and manufactured, or whether there was really something to it, it drew public interest and ratings.
This whole story broke at the exact same time Laura had been asked to do a 2-week series on the paranormal. Instantly, the news director burst into the office and tells Laura that she has to find and speak to the Lutzs. This would fit perfectly into their paranormal programming.
I'm 20 years old. I'm up against the best professionals in the business. But when you're 20, you think you can do anything. You're invincible. So, of course, I'm going to do it. I'm thinking, oh, I might be able to get a raise and a promotion from being a news assistant to something else. So, like everybody else, I was calling William Weber and his law partner, Bernie Burton, saying, hey, can we talk to the Lutzs? Well, let me tell you, William Weber was keeping everybody dangling. He says, well, we are going to be doing an exorcism at the house with white witches. And we have a vampirologist lined up as well. So Channel 7, which was the ABC affiliate, they were going to be in there filming. They said, oh, Channel 5 can come in there filming as well. So I spent a good part of 2 weeks, which is an eon at that time, calling Weber all the time, waiting for updates, but nothing much was happening. So finally, I get the bright idea, let me try and call George Lutz. So I called him at his office, spoke to one of his employees and said, listen, I'm very interested in their story. We're very interested in helping them out. I know a lot of professional investigators that we could put them in touch with. So I would love to speak to them. So I left the phone number at the station. We had a bank, the private lines. That was on a Friday afternoon. And I came back into the office. I think I was probably working a late shift. And he had called back. George Lutz had called back.
The station had answered the call and had tried to connect George with a senior reporter or a news executive. But there was an issue. He only wanted to speak to Laura.
So I called him back right away. I did not tell anybody at the station that I had made arrangements. He said, could you come out and talk to my wife and I? I said, sure. When? The next day, Saturday afternoon, my day off. I said, okay, I'll meet you there. So I was meeting them at his office in Jericho, Long Island. Didn't tell anybody at the station because what if the guy didn't like me and I didn't get the story? I didn't want to overpromise and then underdeliver. This way, if I couldn't get to him, nobody would know about it.
So off to Jericho Laura goes, all by herself. And to her shock, the Lutzs not only invited her in, but spent 5 hours recounting the events in the house to her.
Now, here's the thing, and I'll tell you this. Yes, I was 20 years old, but I was from New York. I didn't just fall off the turnip truck. I was also supposed to be objective and bring back a story. So they start telling me this tale, but in some ways, they're being very vague about what exactly happened. They said that they had mood changes, swings. They were dictatorial with the kids and would order them around like drill sergeants. They would wake up in the middle of the night, the same time as the murders had happened. Kathy looked at herself in the mirror one morning when she was washing her face, and instead of a 29-year-old face, she sees the face of an old hag. George could never get warm. He was constantly had fires going in the house. They had fireplaces along with the heat blazing. Then, of course, there are the stories that many people familiar with the Amityville case will have heard. Black stuff coming out of the faucets and in the toilets. Then he said there was green slime, what George called poltergeist puke in the boathouse. The kids, classmates, when they came to the house, didn't want to stay there. Kathy said that her one aunt, who was a nun, came to visit and she felt ill and had to leave suddenly. Kathy's brother, Jimmy, was getting married and I guess they were having a reception locally, and he was paying the caterers the hall in cash, but his money was lost. His money was lost in the house and he couldn't find it. All things, by the way, that I'm describing that can have certainly medical or very reasonable explanations that have nothing to do with the supernatural.
After 5 long hours of collecting the Lutz's account, Laura went away feeling a sense of disbelief. Not only because their tale was so elaborate, so fantastical, worthy of a Gothic horror novel, but also because, as unreal as the story was, the Lutzs themselves came across very real, very honest, very believable.
I'm telling you, it could have been Brad Pitt, Cate Blanchett, Meryl Streep. If they were lying, they were damn good actors. So they said after that 5.5 hours that I spoke with them, they said, we'll give you and Channel 5 the exclusive. But by the way, don't talk to William Weber because we're not talking to him anymore. Now, the more cynical, or not even cynical, but just, logical people who are listening to this podcast are going to say, yeah, they probably didn't want to share a deal with William Weber. And there is that, that's inescapable. There are very few original ideas, and that one comes to mind really quick. So for those who are saying, wow, none of this ever happened, and it's all a money play, yes. And it could have been. Certainly, as the years have gone on, the Lutzs themselves admitted that once they signed a book deal with Jay Anson, they never met with him. They just sent him all of their tape. And Jay Anson himself said, this is based on a true story. But when asked about some of these things, he said, well, of course I took literary license. So right away you have that. And the Lutzs themselves, when they would subsequently go on to make television and radio appearances and do the press tour when the movie came out, said, yes, many of these things have been exaggerated. We didn't say this. It came out of the movie or the book or just people in their imaginations. But that said, it is inescapably true that George, from the very beginning, much more so than Kathy, was trying to control and drive the narrative. So at that point, we had the exclusive on the story. I then had to find a paranormal investigator to go into the house with us. First person I called was Hans Holzer. And for people not familiar with Hans Holzer, he had gained notoriety in the field of paranormal investigations going back to 1960 with his seminal book, which was called The Ghost Hunter. So I call Hans up, said, hey, have you heard about this story? He says, no, he hadn't heard about it. This is still like mid-February. Again, the story had not really blown up. I said, well, could you come down? Could you come out to the house with us? So Hans says, well, we have to do this right. We want to do an hour-long documentary. I want to get paid, and et cetera. And these were all reasonable requests.
The problem was, there was no budget for this segment. This was not going to be a documentary or a film expose, but rather just a story on the news. There was interest in the Amityville case, but it was still in its infancy. There was no book, no movie, and it still was just a local crime. Hans Holzer wanted to do a properly funded investigation. Channel 5 wanted a quick and punchy paranormal pop piece. So Laura turned to a couple based out of New England that she had also had on Dimensions, who she thought might be eager and willing, but not cost prohibitive.
I called Ed and Lorraine at their house. Lorraine answered, and when I told her what was going on, she asked Ed, hey, pick up the extension, because you had extensions in the house, phone extensions. And I gave them the rundown on the case, what had happened. I said, could you come out? And they said, yes, when do you want us? I said, when, Steve? Tomorrow. They said, okay, fine. And they're in Connecticut. So it was going to be, I would say, about 100-mile drive for them, or 80 miles at least. And Ed and Lorraine Warren did not ask for any money. They said, could Channel 5 pay for our gas and tolls?
Laura had done it. She had secured the Lutzs, the Warrens, and now it was time to confront the house itself. Now, this is where we leave the land of facts and enter into the world of psychics, seances, and paranormal activity. Join us on Halloween night as Laura gives us an exclusive look into the infamous seance held inside High Hopes. You may think you know this story, but have you ever heard it from someone who was actually there? Join us next week as we continue to pull back the curtain and analyze Amityville. Do you have a spooky story you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. Drop me an email at thewestlondonwitch@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Facebook at The West London Witch. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. And come and follow us for additional content on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. The West London Witch is created by me, Rebecca Strazina. Our sound designer and production magician is the incredible Danny Cross. Our theme music was bespokely written and performed by the wickedly talented Kyle Hall. Our cover art is the beautiful collaboration between Lizzie Wilson and Jake Bowser. Special thanks to Miss Sinead Bowers, our quality control and biggest cheerleader. And thank you to you, all of our listeners all over the world. These are your stories. Thank you for sharing them with us.